Okay, so again, welcome everyone. We're here today working with lecture 82, which was March 31st, 1961, when that was first received. And it is a sequel to the one that we did last 2 weeks ago. So the name of it is The Conquest of Duality, Symbolized in the Life and Death of Jesus. So, I don't know, with our new people here, the Pathwork is an interesting thing because it doesn't really endorse any belief structure or religion, but there's a lot of understanding of, here comes Frank, this, way of looking at souls and souls' journeys and, the, whole process of life on Earth, is kind of seen in a cosmological context that includes, the fall of the angels, and then, like the mission that, Jesus made, and many other beings of light as well, that came to Earth, to help with the evolution, the re-evolution of the consciousness on the planet, and the understanding that the evolution here is a kind of in-between place where there's, both light and dark influences. And up until, the time of actual incarnation on the planet, we might have existed before in even darker spaces. So, and then here we have this possibility of, returning, in a way. And the guide says that when the angels fell, which is, of course, ultimately who we are, he kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, well, when they return, like, they'll be better angels than before, right? Better. So there's a way in which it's also this journey of learning and increase in consciousness, and the experience of duality. Then while there's suffering here and difficulty, struggle, life and death kinds of things, right? That it also, is a great teacher, and helps our evolutionary journey in consciousness. So I don't know where people are at with, particular religiously based understanding of Jesus and his mission. This has a slightly different emphasis, but the guide always says that there's nothing really to believe, right? That we can have an open mind and try things on, and if they work, if they fit, then it's useful, and if not to worry about it, basically. So he says, greetings, my dearest friends. God bless each one of you. Blessed is this hour. Today's lecture is a continuation as well as an amplification of the last lecture, Conflicts in the World of Duality. This day commemorates an important event. So this is actually a day, I guess, of Easter or Good Friday or something that this lecture was delivered on. On this day, Good Friday, Jesus Christ brought his life to a culmination in the greatest suffering and the greatest joy. This is meant not only in an abstract or remote spiritual sense, but also in a very human and concrete sense. Suffering and joy, pleasure and pain are dualities that in the final analysis are subdivisions of the great duality, life and death, never life or death. A spiritual teaching often misunderstood says that one must rise above pleasure and pain. This is, of course, true in the ultimate sense. However, it cannot come about by flight from the unpleasantness of the duality. Instead, the transcendence of pleasure and pain happens only by accepting and fully facing the duality, life and death. Those who misunderstand the meaning of rising above pleasure and pain do so because they wish to avoid rather than go through these deep experiences. However, it is only when you accept death in its undisguised nakedness without running from it that you can truly live, and only then will you find that there is no death and no duality. You can experience this only in the infinitely great and ultimate issues when you learn to experience it first in your daily little deaths. When your will is done and you cringe from suffering in the wrong and unhealthy way, you increase the tragic duality. You reject death, and therefore in the ultimate sense you reject life. The flight from death and suffering causes flight from life and pleasure, often inadvertently. No matter how much one may strive for joyful participation in life and pleasure, when one consciously or unconsciously avoids facing and meeting death and suffering, the escape will also be a flight from life and pleasure. Jesus saying, "Become ye as little children," has meanings on many levels. One is that children live and experience very acutely. All their senses and faculties are new and fresh, and every life experience on any level of their being is much more acute than the impressions, reactions, and experiences of the adult. It is much better for the development and growth of an entity to go through many heights and depths than to falsely construct a serenity that is rarely a true detachment. Detachment is achieved only after one has accepted all that life has to offer, including death. Only those who have gone through the feared experience will arrive at true serenity. The soul whose serenity is not real or is artificially cultivated is much less developed than those who are courageous enough not to flee from the life experience. But it often happens that the former believes to be above the latter whom he or she despises for their ups and downs. These ups and downs indeed indicate that those people are still deeply involved in the illusion of opposites and duality. Nevertheless, they meet the illusion and grapple with it, which is honest and growth-producing. Courage and honesty are perhaps the most important assets in one's development. If you face your suffering and your joy, you will grow. The person who cringes away from suffering, denying, never facing it, and irrationally fearing it beyond its true proportions, is inevitably equally afraid of happiness and fulfillment. When happiness is far away and seemingly unattainable, you can safely long for it. However, if you observe yourself closely, you will see that when you get near it, you cringe from it just as you cringe from suffering. And since suffering and pain or death and life are connected and are in reality one and the same, your happiness and pleasure are also connected to your attitude toward death and suffering. As you accept the one, so you will accept the other. As you rise and grow through the one, so do you rise and grow through the other. So let me pause here and see, are there questions? Are you able to apply this a little more, as he's describing it? Anybody want to comment?
My only comment, Darlene, is my younger years, I tried the experiment for years of trying to avoid the pain and have the pleasure, and it never worked. I spent a lot of time in depression. So this lecture just resonates so truly with me, and at my age, it is how I live my life now, and I'm willing to go through the whole gamut as much as I know how. And it's amazing. It still looks like going through the suffering is the end of everything. and I asked for help, and I come out the other side. It's like a new side of me unfolds, and it's subtle, but it's amazing how it works. And so this makes complete sense to me. It's great.
Great. Thanks for the example. Yeah. And in this lecture, he doesn't include this so much, but I think, in emotional growth and its function and some of the others, he talks about, trying to avoid the pain. We kind of try to numb out in some way, right? And he was mentioning that, and become as little children, but But, it makes sense when you think about it that, if you numb against pain, you're also going to numb against, the other feelings, the good feelings, and so in some ways this is when, Susan wrote her book, The Undefended Self, is what we're talking about, right? That the defenses, like you said, seem to, just perpetuate the suffering, increase it, and there's this kind of way of surrendering and going into, through, and out the other side. And then, in that same way, there is in that sense, a resurrection, or some new perspective, or some development and growth with it that usually happens. So, exactly. So, anybody else? So your attitude towards suffering determines whether or not your soul benefits during the experience, or only much later. Even a blind and rebellious attitude towards suffering will eventually benefit the soul, and it is better than a flight from suffering by paralyzing and deadening the capacity to feel and experience. So, what he's saying here is, like, sometimes, we can, it's more honest emotionally in some ways, to react and be rebellious and fight. Sometimes we're in pain and maybe we're angry at God, or we're angry at the pain, or we're angry, and so there's, in a way, we need to ultimately go beyond that for peace, right, and acceptance. But that's a closer step than sort of a false serenity mask, trying to rise above it again. It's better than a flight from suffering, right? So, however, a blind and ignorant attitude towards suffering will make you suffer more and longer than necessary. The process of growth can commence only when your consciousness has learned not to avoid it. It's all growing pains, in some ways, is what he's saying, right? Conversely, a healthy attitude that retains awareness will obtain immediate growth and liberation. That which formerly made you suffer ceases to be an element of pain the instant you recognize the lesson it can teach you. By no means does this imply that you should deliberately choose suffering and reject happiness in the false belief that pleasure and joy are contrary to the will of God. Many religions teach this error. The healthy way to meet suffering is perhaps the most important key in life. If you meet it openly and wholeheartedly, willing to learn from it, keeping your reason and faculties intact. Although emotionally you may be plunged in darkness, rebellion, cowardice, and self-pity, the outcome will be happiness to the degree you have grown from the suffering you have gone through. And I found this true as well, right? And it's also part of that, in the midst of it, it seems like it's not so great, but he's talking here about, like trying to do this, and it's possible. It takes a little practice, right? But to be present, when he says keeping, your reason and faculties intact, right? So we usually kind of get possessed emotionally by our pain bodies when we go into these places of suffering, and there's usually a dynamic and a pattern within it for each of us, right? Because we have certain particular pain bodies that are with us, and these are part of our, spiritual mission as well, to bring them here and then to try to, find our way back into the light with them, right? And we are the light ultimately, and it is the light that we can, allows us to, be able to do this. But, in the beginning, we're totally tangled up in it, right? And we're totally identified with our pain bodies. And so, we, kind of fall into it and feel sort of lost in this story and in the feelings, and it's what the guide calls an image, right? It's a very painful place, and ultimately it's not even true, right? That we're lost in it and it's not even quite real. There's some kind of overgeneralization, there's some kind of projection, there's some kind of negative judgment in it that's not really in reality. And so, when we do that, we're not completely keeping our reason and faculties intact, right? But we can learn how to be present, to go in sort of in our heart with our higher self, with our consciousness present. And sometimes, the journey is to sort of wake up inside of the pain body, possession, like, so you're completely lost in it. But sometimes you're familiar enough that oh, I've been here before, I know there's something going on. So you can, begin to kind of question and pull out of it enough consciously to begin to work with. And part of that, is just to, be aware, that you're, in a state where there might be some reaction, some defense, and some rebellion, some resistance that, would be good to just work with, right? Find a way to understand and transform, because we're always, almost all the healing is working with our resistance, right? Working with, these places of where the images have plunged us into this kind of duality, and we're struggling between these two deaths. And so I don't know, again, these are very expanded lectures that kind of cover the whole path and many concepts here. So for the new people, don't be discouraged if you are not quite following everything. It's totally all right. After you have a few of these more under your belt, you'll begin to sort of get the pattern and the connection that he's working with, and different facets, right? Almost every lecture is seeing life in this fashion, but from different facets. So he says again, the healthy way to meet suffering is perhaps the most important key in life. If you meet it openly and wholeheartedly willing to learn from it, keeping your reason and faculties intact. Although emotionally you may be plunged in darkness, rebellion, cowardice, and self-pity, the outcome will be happiness to the degree you have grown from the suffering you have gone through. If the suffering deadens your soul, more suffering, perhaps in a different form, must follow until you no longer allow your soul to be deadened by it. Then your entire personality will be revived by increased self-awareness. So it sort of reminds me, like a lot of times, suffering seems to sort of befall us, like fate or some kind of event happens or some kind of argument that we weren't intending or some kind of, difficulty. And, we kind of wonder, like, okay, why am I, why is the universe taking me here, right? Or why do I have to experience this? Or, what part of me is creating this? Because the guide is basically saying we're, projecting and sort of walking through our inner landscape, right? And it's good to understand what we're experiencing, have a kind of co-created or self-created aspect that we can then, try to be a little more conscious of. And as we, see that, there's a kind of way that if we ask ourselves, why do I have to go through this? Life will answer, because you need to feel something, right? Right now this is a feeling that is somehow not, ultimately in reality. There's an aspect of image, there's an aspect of suffering in it. And unless you encounter it, you will never be conscious of it. And so, in some ways life has to arrange, and life is you in another form, right? Like your spirit projected into the sort of this substance, that creates this experience of 3D reality, right? And so you're bringing it to yourself in some way so you can wake yourself up. So does that make sense? Anybody want to ask questions or comment there? Particular confusion confronts a growth-pursuing spirit in its approach to suffering. Many self-aware people understand that suffering is self-created. Your realization of this, whether vaguely or fully, causes you to become frantic when suffering comes your way, if for no other reason than the frustration of not knowing instantly by what particular attitude or action you have created it. Since you are impatient, either consciously or unconsciously, to find out, you sabotage all your attempts to get to the cause. What is done in impatience, haste, frustration, or fear inevitably slows down the process of activity. And so in some ways we're always sort of trying to learn and help and support ourselves and relaxing, right? And trusting, in breathing through and just pausing, before, we assume that danger is here, or, we're lost in the story, some story that, again, usually is some repetition for us, even in from past lives, right? So many people begin to experience pattern in their life journey, and sort of like, well, it seems like I've been here before, in this feeling, in this dynamic with another person, with all of these experiences. There's this, sense of stuckness and recycling of some kind of thing. And so when that's there, it is difficult, because we hate, the suffering that goes with it, and sometimes we feel caught in it and lost in it, and so we, feel like, we need to, kind of impatiently, fight it, or, we get afraid of ourselves because somehow we don't know why why we're going through it, right? And so again, some of the work is to just kind of slow it all down when we're in pain and suffering, emotionally, even physically, to go and sit with it, right? Like in a mindful approach, to notice how it is in our bodies, and to just kind of hold a space, feel what our impatience feels like, right? Or our haste, or our frustration, or our fear, which is the first level, right? And then to see if we can, drop below that. So, this is kind of the hardest place for many of us, and especially in the New Age, where we begin to have this sense of self-responsibility, and then, we create something that's difficult, and then we think, oh, what I do, I'm bad, I'm fucked up, like there's this kind of self-judgment also that can get in and make it, like a lot more harder to, let go and heal and understand. So, our job is to see that there are approaches that we unconsciously have to our suffering, and that those approaches are intensifying and not helping, and to try to kind of crack the cosmic egg, or crack the habitual pattern, right? To become aware and try something different, choose another possibility. And again, there has to be a certain amount of awakeness, in the midst of our defensive reactions, which is not easy. So there's a lot of self-knowledge here, a lot of often falling into our patterns, because in some ways we're learning them, and we have to see them again and again to understand them fully, right? And when the ego mind, like rebels and, thinks there's something wrong because, oh, here we are again. And at some point, we want to go beyond, but most of the time, if we're back there, we're not ready yet, right? There's something more to learn in this pattern. And if we don't turn against ourselves, then it's much easier to see it and learn it, right? And change happens. When we judge ourselves and get into a kind of battle with ourselves, then it's just adds to the suffering, and we can't really get deep enough into the self-knowledge and the inner questioning because of the self-judgment. So self-acceptance, self-responsibility, these are two of the main pillars, right? So there's that the pathwork is based on. Forgot where I was last, so I'm just going to start here. What is done in impatience, haste, frustration, or fear inevitably slows down the process of activity. Those who believe that God caused their suffering, which they have to accept without understanding the reason, often fare better. Like there's a stage of consciousness where we just kind of we're sort of accept that we can't possibly understand, and in some ways that's a truth, right? But we need to come to it, at another level of consciousness, right? Because the Pathwork Guide says, a lot of our suffering is caused because we just can't see the bigger picture of what's happening. And, and sometimes, in a more simple state of consciousness where, he says again, we're not maybe seeing our self-created causes, which is useful, but we don't suffer as much because we kind of just surrender and accept that this is something we have to go through. And in that surrender, we don't suffer half as much as when we're, judging ourselves or life or somebody else or something, when we're struggling. So they may not discover their self-created underlying causes, and this is a pity, since this too has to be done, but their attitude is much more relaxed and open. However, the belief that God causes suffering is shaped by a lazy fatalism and leads to the logical conclusion that God is cruel and sadistic. The best way of dealing with suffering combines the active spirit of searching one's own inner hidden causes with a relaxed attitude of accepting for the moment the unwanted pain and fully understanding that the self-produced misery is of therapeutic value. So let me pause here and see any comment, question. How are we doing with this so far?
I've got one again, Darlene. I spent a lot of years after the S training, and they kind of said, you need to go through it or go into your suffering, or well, they didn't phrase it quite that way. But I spent years what I would call wallowing in the suffering. And is there a way you could, I don't know if this is coming up later, or maybe it's already being addressed, but how would you describe, or do you know what I mean by wallowing in it? Or
Yeah.
so how would you describe the difference between that and what the pathwork, what the lecture is saying right here?
In terms of just feeling the feeling and
yeah, because wallowing, I seem to never get out of it. It just kind of was that.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, wallowing is, my sense of that generally, when I'm, is a kind of, first of all, a self-identification, with the suffering. So, it's kind of like, that's who I am, and it's almost like the guide speaks about this too, like it's, we, see it as our identity, and then it is kind of our specialness in some way, in some sense, right? And we have trouble letting go of that. And then in another sense, it's also, the negative pleasure, right, that is in the suffering, right? Because he says there's negative pleasure and there's negative intention where, we're in a negative situation. So oftentimes, he says as children we learn to, get pleasure out of the suffering. And he says that was important in some ways because we have to have pleasure to grow, And so even if the pleasure is this kind of underneath, sort of negative resentment, that the parents are, bad or what, or, you don't get what you need or something like that, there's a kind of energy, life force that you need and you aren't able to access in the positive sense. So you know, a lot of times we do. We just identify, we wrap it around and carry it as a badge or a, you know, special thing, even if it's especially bad, you know, or we, you know, have a kind of, you know, negative pleasure in something that's there, you know, like even that thing often with the patterns that we have, you know, is like there's a certain kind of negative pleasure in our ego saying, see, I knew it, you know, there it happened again, right? You know, there's a kind of, you know, sense of self-justification or self-righteousness or something, you know, that helps us somehow feed off of the negative situation, you know, rather than, you know, realize and just, you know, kind of healthily work through it, right? So there's attachment, identification, pleasure, in a negative sense there. Does that help? Does that cover the
Yeah,
question?
what pops into my brain is there was a kind of, well, I spent a lot of my years in depression on various levels.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if it's a soup that combines depression with going through a negative experience, and maybe it really made a swamp.
No, I agree, and my belief is that depression is kind of what we work a lot here with, because I also had a lot of experience with depression when I was younger, and you know that what actually, I mean, you know, even healthy humans that are not depressed have difficulty with this, and then I think those that are depressed are, you know, like really intensely in this internal self-destructive battle with themselves. And it's you know, and maybe it's a vicious circle, you know, like you're depressed, so you're unhappy with being depressed, so you know, you can't figure out why you can't not be depressed, you know, so you know, that, like, again, you just kind of tighten the noose, and most of it, I think, is the self-judgment. So a lot of, to me, the healing of my depression, you know, came, you know, with that aspect of the pathwork, the self-acceptance part, you know. And the guide says this a lot, you know, like the ISI, the idealized self-image, the judge in us, you know, wants us to be further along than where we are. You know, wants us not to have to go through this, but going through this is what's a part of the plan, right? You know, we need to grow from it, and you know, and then we turn against ourselves and think there's something wrong with us, or, you know, and that turning against ourselves is the one thing I think that we really can't have happiness when we do, right? I think it's one of the most intense forms of suffering that we experience, and the problem is nothing can, you know, get us out of that. You know, it's a personal choice. We have to see it and choose. We have to recognize it, see what we're doing, and you know, and the choice is like on one level a choice, but, you know, in some sense, I guess we have to learn to fall back in love with ourselves, or accept ourselves as we are and our imperfection, and learn humility. You know, there's different layers and levels of this. Learning to just accept ourselves exactly as we are. And then I found that, you know, the more that we do that, the more we, you know, we can also recognize our light and our, you know, and have access to it, right? You know, when we're not burdening ourselves with our own self-hatred, you know, then we can begin to blossom. But nobody can blossom under the weight of their own whip. It's just not possible.
Sometimes.
Yeah, that's helpful. You're touching chords there that make sense to me. So that's a question. I'm definitely moving out of that phase, but I mean, it still waddles in there. So it's curious.
Right. And you know, that's right. You know, nothing goes. You know, it's kind of this gradual process, right, of moving beyond it, and, you know, less and less suffering from it. But then, you know, life will bring to us, because, you know, in some ways we got like a well of this stuff that, you know, we have to make sure is emptied out, you know, and we can kind of only do it in waves. We can't do it kind of all at once. And so, you know, some of the recycling, I think, is just that. Again, why is life bringing this to me? I need to feel something. What is it I'm feeling? And if you go in and you see where you may be feeling other things, and then on top of that, you're feeling self-hatred. Like where you have to start is to remove the self-hatred and then see what you're really feeling, because the self-hatred is, like, in some ways, if you get into that cosmology, that the idealized self-image, is Satan. And in a sense, Satan, actually, that word, means the accuser, right? And so it's that state of consciousness that is our inner accuser. And we need to face, and sometimes, like hold trial, hold a court, like you've got a prosecutor. So, like, okay, bring out what the prosecution is saying, but then, respond, like we have to answer to that, is that true, and sometimes, we're so confused and lost, we believe the prosecutor's version. And the sadness of that is that the prosecutor's version is never really the total truth. I mean, it has elements of truth, that's why we swallow it. But it's never the total truth, because within that, is the implication that, we should, we don't deserve to exist or something, like that there's something wrong with us, and we're just growing. So, the self-compassion and the, again, that self-acceptance is a huge key, along with this self-responsibility. Okay, so true growth happens only when you tackle your seemingly insignificant daily reactions of desire and fear. Okay, so now he's kind of trying to make it a little practical. So, one of the suggestions here, now what he means by tackle, hopefully he'll say a little more, but, he's already kind of pointed to, we need to face and feel, right? All of the little daily reactions, and notice, our desires and our fears. Only then will you learn the right attitude toward life and death. See how you run from death in the little things and recoil from suffering in the minute details of life that could in themselves be unimportant. Question yourself about the most mundane and insignificant issues which cause you the slightest disharmony. And this is really good advice, because sometimes, like we can't see the forest for the trees, or where we're in a lot of suffering, the pain body is so active, we can't quite, get separated from it enough. But where we have these little triggers, and so he suggests that we actually do a kind of daily review, where it can be very simple, like just a 2-column technique, where you just scan after, maybe in the evening or the next morning or something, the day, right? Like review your day. And just on one column, you put down anything that caused disharmony, any kind of trigger, or event that you noticed that, activated some. And he's saying it doesn't have to be a huge thing, even insignificant issues. And feel, right, that disharmony. And with the less significant things, we can learn to tolerate and explore and kind of dialogue and seek out to understand, the self-knowledge, which is the third pillar of the pathwork. So there's self-responsibility, self-acceptance, and self-knowledge, right? When you pursue this self-questioning to the point of asking, why do I want this? Oh, maybe I didn't finish. Like, so with the 2-column technique, so you put the trigger down, right, and then you actually write down also, like, what did you notice you were feeling, and so then you can also then scan over it over a period of time, a week, 2 weeks, or whatever, and see some patterns, right? And the patterns are also useful in understanding and discovering some of your images that are active. So that this is a good little process or exercise that you can do to begin to just become a little more aware of these things that are the desires and the fears, right? So when you pursue this self-questioning to the point of asking, why do I want this? Why do I fear not getting it? You will come to the love you desire and to your fear of not getting that. When you flee from love, fearful that you may not get it anyway, or that you may lose it again, you are caught in the wrong attitude toward death. I have outlined in the last lecture that manifests in your courting death because you fear it, right? He talked about that in the other way. And so sometimes when we fear that, like the love that we want, the goodness that we seek, is not available, we either, kind of go numb and avoid, right? Or we actually, say, I'm going to die anyway, let me just, sort of negatively identify with and be caught in that. I think we talked a little bit about, the way that we get lost in identification and suffering. So, in a similar way, you reject love when we're afraid of being hurt, and I hear that all the time, like, how can I, keep my heart open, I'm just going to get hurt again, or we'll, get disappointed again, right? And I mean, it's true, it's a death, it's a small death every time, we reach out, we open ourselves, we, desire something and are disappointed, or, it doesn't turn out exactly as we wanted it, because there's a part of our consciousness that, like we want it exactly the way we want it, and if it's a little bit off, then everything is screwed up, so we really get attached, and our will gets invested, right? And then if it goes a little differently, it triggers a lot of reaction inside of us. And so this is again part of our evolution in consciousness, because we need to go from sort of this demand to have it exactly as we think it should be, without collapsing into this, place of, okay, I'm just going to close my heart, I'm not going to risk, I'm not going to care, or, I'm going to just be negative, and, no longer suffer, protect myself in that way. But again, as he was talking in the beginning, when we go to that kind of protection, not only do we numb out the pain or, defend against the pain, but, the lack of love is a death in itself, right? And as we go there, we are refusing the risk of love, but we're also never going to have that full experience, right? So the same happens when you inwardly try to convince yourself that you do not want life, because you know that one day life in the body will cease, right? Or, life can be painful. So in some ways, again, this is back to embracing suffering and embracing pain, which is so counterintuitive for the ego. All little issues ultimately lead to the question of being loved versus not being loved, and therefore to life versus death. When from your fear of not getting what you really want, you deliberately choose what you don't want, you create an unhealthy, deadening condition within your soul. This condition is unhealthy because you deny yourself what you actually could have, although it may not be to the degree you wish it. You may not get the kind of love you desire, exclusive, limitless, guaranteed with absolute certainty that you will never lose it again. But because any limitations of your wish could create unbearable frustration of your exaggerated belief that the non-fulfillment of your wish is unbearable, you forfeit the love you could have by rejecting it altogether, which makes it worse. In the same way, your desire never to die makes you reject life. So that's a big sentence there. Let's see if we can back up a little again. So he says you may not get the kind of love you desire, which is often in the, in the child consciousness, we want exclusive, limitless, perfect love, right? And that's what we needed from our parents, or we needed really healthy love, right? But again, the child wanted that, right? And because our parents didn't always have healthy love, there were certain ways that we did suffer as children, right? And so those places also are often, part of this recreation, this kind of, exaggerated fear of a certain experience, right? The loss of love, the rejection, that kind of thing. It was very painful as children. We didn't have any way to integrate it, and we were very vulnerable and open, right? And so there's a kind of way that we have to also learn that fear of this original pain is not real now, right? It's like there is an exaggerated fear that we have because we were so young and vulnerable about what it means to feel disappointment, what it means to feel like somebody, rejects us, or is mad at us or something like that. So as we mature and grow, we can come to a place where, as long as especially we accept ourselves, right, or we have this love for ourselves, even, it's great when other people want to love us too, but when they don't, it's not the end of the world, right? It's not this final unbearable belief that, because that we can't get this love that we so much want, we must be failures, or God must not love us either, or we're not doing it right. There's all kinds of ways that or somebody else is the cause of it, right? We'll turn our blame outside of ourselves. But blame on any level is not useful. Most important in this respect is that so often you are unaware that what you fear are death and suffering, and rejection of love signifies both. You run away not only from death and suffering, but also from your fear of both. So, this is one of the things that happens, is the compound emotions, right? So we have fear, and then we have fear of the fear. And we have anger, and then we have, anger over the anger. It's kind of like things get compounded. And so, we have to kind of go through the layers. And so in some ways, first of all, in this, we often have to just tolerate the suffering that is what fear feels like in our bodies, right? Fear feels not so good in us. Many people that suffer from anxiety can testify to this, right? As well as depression, but anxiety, is more with the fear, or people have phobias or that kind of thing, right? And so we have to, experience our fear of fear first, and go through that, and then explore, okay, and then what death do we have to die, right? That's real. And sometimes that is a loss. There's grief in life, there is pain in life, and there is real, sadness and going through strong experiences of deprivation and challenge. But there's a way in which again, if we can understand and face this and realize that there's a journey that we are assenting to, and is useful in the long run, that helps a lot. And then, like the guide often says, we tend to awfulize our experiences, right? Because the child consciousness just doesn't want to have any difficulty, right? Wants life to be perfect and always easy and wonderful, and so whenever anything goes bad, we're frustrated, and where there's often old pattern, an old wound, we awfulize it and get all lost in that pain-bodied place. So again, to go inside and feel it, actually feel this in the moment. It's alive in you now, right? And feel it in your body, and feel, like listen, what does the belief have to say, and is that really true, and can you tolerate the feeling, and can you just call light there, and clear it, because feelings are like, energies in the body, and it's like a big weather system in the body, right? And we can calm it, and we can, clear the clouds away, and we can do things like that when we are, it's kind of like, actually the body naturally does that when we're not fighting it. So as we learn to just come and be with this stuff, we also learn how to assist, you know, calming the internal weather and allowing it to actually, you know, transform itself in these places where we, you know, have a story, right? And then we have to face into that story, and we're sure that we're going to die. We're sure that it's, you know, it's like we're back in the same terrible place that, you know, we've been trying to avoid all our lives. And then if we, you know, stay with it, and I mean, you know, oftentimes we just have to and let go of the story, you can move through it. If you stay caught in the story, you keep recycling it, right? So part of this work is just really becoming conscious of these images, these, you know, beliefs and stories that we tell ourselves about our experiences. There's the experience, and then there's the interpretation of the experience, and that interpretation is often a child's interpretation and is not the ultimate reality and truth. So, once again, the pathwork sort of in a nutshell. As you become aware of your real fear of death in any form, physical death itself or a negative occurrence, you free the life force in you, which will then invigorate you to meet that which you fear. And so, you know, it's like, in some ways, the prayer is not, you know, like, oh, just, you know, like, let me avoid this experience, but the prayer is kind of like, give me the courage, give me, you know, the wherewithal, give me, you know, the consolation and the love to go through this experience, right? And learn from it, use it well and wisely. So, and then, you know, it really does transform us. And so then he goes into the next part of the lecture, which is about how, you know, Jesus demonstrated all of this in his life and death. So it says, the life of Jesus Christ symbolizes this age-old truth in a very wonderful way. It has been known by all the sages and great truth seekers of all times. It is represented in many philosophies, religions, and myths. Through Jesus Christ, it has been symbolized in his actual life and death. For Jesus met his death in the very spirit I have stated here. Many of Jesus' sayings and utterances were not recorded or passed on, especially those not understood by people, because in humanity's limited understanding they seem to contradict his other teachings. It is not mere coincidence, however, that his last utterance was recorded and passed on to humanity, in spite of it seemingly so crassly contradictory to what people believed of and want to see in Jesus Christ. Jesus' last words on the cross expressed his doubt and fear that he was forsaken by God. This has puzzled many people. How could this great spirit doubt and fear? Human illusion and idealization would have preferred that Jesus died in a glory of faith without the human doubts and fears he expressed in the hour of the culmination of his suffering. It was very important that this utterance be transmitted to humanity. Every single facet of Jesus' life and death has deep symbolic meaning for humanity's personal problems. So this utterance, too, must have significance. It can be fully understood only if you grasp the meaning of this lecture and the previous one. In his last hour, Jesus forgot all he had known, all the revelations and insights he had gained. And I think if we all think about it, you know, that happens to, you know, like we do a lot of development, we have great understanding, sometimes we pass some tests, but then again, sometimes these pain bodies overtake us, and here we are back in the same old place, right? You know, and it's like we're back in hell, you know, and we've forgotten. We're no longer in possession of the consciousness that knew all of these truths spiritually that we have discovered. And this is very important, because we will all face those kinds of experiences. Has it not happened to each one of you to some degree in hours of depression and anxiety that even though your intellectual memory retained what you have learned and known, you were not in command of this knowledge? Your soul was in a dark night of unbelief and doubt. Deceiving yourself about this state of mind and not acknowledging how you really feel is not the right solution. To feel guilty and proud, as you think I should not feel and think this way, leads you only to self-deception that delays your coming out of your darkness. Jesus illustrated this most clearly. He, the greatest of all created spirits, was in doubt too. He too had lost faith for a moment, but he acknowledged it and did not hide it from himself or from others. What does that mean? It means the stark, naked fear of the unknown, death, and the acute suffering of physical, mental, and spiritual pain. Jesus met it squarely, without pretense, without self-deception, without deceiving those who had faith in him. He was truthful to himself and therefore to all who believed in him. He was truthful even to his last moment. Many a spiritual teacher or authority would hesitate to admit moments of fear and doubt, would feel ashamed and afraid of losing faith with the disciples. So let me just pause for a second and open it up to comments and questions. How's this going down? Anybody want to speak to this? So I find, go ahead, yeah. Go ahead, Ursula.
No. Um, no, I just find it that what the Bible says about Jesus in the cross was very, very powerful for a lot of people. Like they take it too much at heart. That they say, he died for us, he suffered for us, he did all this for us. I just feel that for us, spiritually, it's like you take this pain that he suffered in. So what I understand is like you have to be honest with the fear, like the fear of death, that you're not, if Jesus went through that and he is, the Son of God, or, if you want to believe that, you have to accept that, yes, you must fear death, and you don't have to say, like, I want to live forever. You can say, I fear death, but I want to live my life fully. Yeah, is that correct?
Yes, beautiful, well put. Yeah, and of course we have lots of, there's a lot of misconceptions and ways that, it's taught, that the guide would point out, has some distortions, but that piece is, I think, like well said. I think sometimes people, misunderstand sort of the simple truth of it, and then kind of go into sort of an exaggerated, identification, like I think he might talk about this later, or he did in the other lecture, where, people get ascetic, or, they think that they should, whip themselves, or, starve themselves, or, to suffer with Jesus, or, like that kind of thing. And I think, there's a way that we can also distort sort of this embrace of suffering and this acceptance of suffering and make it, into some kind of identity and, craziness. But the like everything, duality does that, and it turns a beautiful truth into kind of two sides that are both in distortion. But it sounds like the way you understood that is exactly what he was saying. So he's truthful to himself and therefore to all who believed in him, even to his last moment. Right? And he didn't hide in his mask and, like all of that, or mislead us, in some way that we should somehow, be above it all. Now, sometimes I think in certain aspects of Christianity, people, think that way and try, but the way the guide is talking about it, there's a deep lesson in this, profound humility and acceptance of exactly where we are every moment of the journey. So most did not know that in this very doubt and fear was an important and directive and lesson for all. Even though they did not consciously understood, inwardly they felt more strengthened than ever, because truth goes directly to the heart and soul, even if at times it bypasses the brain. When intellectual explanations do not obscure what the heart and soul perceive, and the personality allows the intuition to function in spite of seemingly contradictory intellectual considerations, the person has a deep purity and innocence that has nothing to do, with the words purity and innocence as used by, bigoted religionists. The person who has this innocence and purity adopts the childlike attitude Jesus recommended. Jesus' advice to become as little children praises children's willingness to experience life intensely. Jesus' disciples have this quality. They too experience fully. And Jesus Christ himself showed this amply in his life as well as in his death. He went through his suffering to the full extent without restriction, without shame in admitting his doubt and fear, pain and vulnerability. Only those who have this great childlike openness can experience true joy. And this he demonstrated not only during his life, but also by his reappearance in spirit. But of that, very little is recorded. And so I think here he's referring to, something earlier in the lecture too, like when we can fully accept our suffering, our joy is immense. And many, awakened souls speak to that, like there's, even though, there's just, even in the suffering, there's a fabulous, beauty or joy, in things. And again, this full emergence in life, like you were saying, Ursula, living fully, we can die fully in some sense. And they say, live well, die well, right? So again, as it occurs, so often this factor is misunderstood or not fully understood. Even those who understand that Jesus' resurrection and appearance indicated the continuation of spirit life, they do not go far enough in understanding this phenomenon from a worldly point of view. They think simply that Jesus showed only that life goes on, and that is all there is to it. This phenomenon was not meant to prove just that life does continue in the spirit. It will mean something more to you right here and right now while you are still in this incarnation. If Jesus Christ in his hour of despair forgot what he had known, it is even more certain that other people will do the same when going through hardship. Intellectual conviction can only do so much in such times. Jesus knew this better than anyone. Jesus' reappearance could not be more than theory for those who were not present, and for the succeeding generations, it did not bear a deeper meaning. His reappearance clearly states, after having met my ordeal fully, without pretense and self-deception, having gone through it to the ultimate end, I now live in the true, full sense of the word. You too can do it. You do not have to wait for physical death, because you die many deaths every day in all your little ordeals and struggles. The manner in which you meet these determines the subsequent life and fullness of joy that can be yours. If you meet these ordeals and struggles in a similar spirit of truthfulness, you will experience life and joy while still in the body to the same degree. This is the message, the ultimate meaning of his reappearance, apart from other meanings. Here is the greatest lived symbolism ever demonstrated. So life on earth is a symbol of reality and not vice versa. And so it is with Jesus' life and death. It meant much more than a lesson to each individual about the history of evolution, life and death, and the promise after death. To find out what it really means, you do not have to wait until the time when you leave your earthly body. You have daily opportunities. Whether you can now believe in life after death does not even matter. Every day offers an opportunity for everyone, whatever he or she may or may not believe, to make the best of life by realizing what the everyday little death is, meeting it, and in so doing, learning to discriminate between that which is inevitable and that which is not. This reminds me of the Serenity Prayer, right? If you meet that which is inevitable, physical death as well as the results of your past wrong attitudes, in a spirit of relaxed acceptance, while at the same time wanting to grow and learn from the experience, you will recognize where and in what way you chose difficulties that are not inevitable. And for the moment you choose the later, for the more you choose the later, the more you invite and court extremes that could be avoided. Only by a very personal self-search can you determine how you react to both that which is inevitable and that which is not. So again, the Serenity Prayer, what is it? Grant me the, acceptance, or the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. And this is a deep study, right? Because our egos, we often want to, change and do not want to accept the true, things that we need to surrender to. And then sometimes also we are surrendering in a way of submission, right? That is also in distortion, and is not the way through either. This question poses a problem similar to that of independence and interdependence. Only personal self-analysis can provide the answer to each individual. There is no way, no general rule to which one can rigidly adhere. So he's recapitulating. Since isolation and loneliness come from an inner unrecognized dependency, as opposed to the healthy interdependence, which results from reliance on the inner self, so it is with the question of inevitability. By running away from that which is inevitable, you bring upon yourself avoidable handicaps. You are so afraid of the inevitable hardship that you take onto yourself more hardship. Find this pattern and you're bound to discover that inevitable hardship ceases after you have acknowledged and gone through it. So one way I like to talk about this a little bit, is sort of in an image. We learn that, sort of like when we're not in reality, we create this duality that means that, we have a kind of, no matter what we do, it's not ideal, and so, we struggle with this, because we want perfection, and then we run headlong into, like we have to give up that perfection in two different directions, no matter which way we turn. So, one way, we discover that we're avoiding the immediate, feared death, but as we try to avoid that, and we look over the long run, through a lifetime or whatever, we begin to see that, by avoiding that, we are recreating and keep re-experiencing it time and again, and so there's the short, quick death on one side of the ledger, and there's the long, slow death on the other side of the ledger. Right? And so it's kind of like we have to begin to recognize, right, that when we're avoiding the quick, short death, that there is a long, slow death that we may, be choosing instead. And this is usually not so conscious, right? The cause and effect of things are not always totally clear to us. So that's a good way, though, to explore your duality and your, images, is where you see you're in a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, and neither of your options is what you really want, right? That tells you right there that you are, dealing with an image which is ultimately an overgeneralization of an experience that was a negative experience, and then you've kind of tried to codify it, and avoid it that way. All men are this way, so or all work, or all we have much more sophisticated ones than those, largely.
Question.
So we all have images about those different things, but we also have our personal images. Is there a question?
Oh, yeah. Just going back on the last paragraph when she mentions dependency and healthy interdependence.
Uh-huh.
Oh, can you go over that a little bit more?
Sure. you know, he brings it in kind of off of the side of things. I thought it was kind of interesting, but he's just saying that it's a similar issue of this problem of independence and interdependence in terms of kind of like there's a right balance. In other words, you know, like no human is really independent, right? You know, I mean, we are so dependent and interdependent on everything in the world, you know, like even the plants to breathe by and everything like that. So you know, it's not like a rigid, you know, I can do it all by myself kind of thing. That would lead to isolation and aloneness, you know, but also sort of dependency, right, you know, is kind of usually the other side of the coin, you know, independent or dependent, right, and the truth is really in the interdependence. But where we are dependent, I think, you know, we think that you know, we can't, you know, who we are is not sufficient, and we need somebody else to save us or to take care of us or to, you know, not be mean to us or whatever, right? And to be responsible and take care to remove our suffering in some way. And so this is a kind of dependence on somebody else around something that, you know, they have, you know, it's not real again. So he goes down below and he says, since isolation and loneliness come from an inner unrecognized dependency, you know, so, you know, it's kind of like where we are misperceiving how to feel connected. And we think, you know, like we're little, it's kind of like a child state, right? And we think we don't have enough to be dependent and we need other people. And healthy interdependence, which results from reliance on the inner self, right? You know, so that doesn't mean that, you know, I never am going to want someone else, you know, to help me or to care for me or anything like that. But if I don't believe that I can rely on myself, then if others are not there, I'm in a big trouble, right? You know, like, and then I get into demand or I get into this kind of dependency, which is not healthy. You know, if I know that basically whatever I experience is something that God, you know, trusts me to handle, you know, it's like, and I wouldn't have created it, and we can never suffer something that, you know, we can't really manage. You know, it's like sometimes we can refuse to do that, but, you know, in the long run, the idea is what we go through, you know, it's we are sufficient unto it in some way. So this, you know, way that we think that we don't have enough, we don't have everything, and we need God and we need others. But the first foundation of that is to feel, you know, solid and like we can rely on ourselves. And then when others inevitably disappoint us, which they will, like we are not completely devastated. Does that kind of clarify that part of it? You know, and then it's like he's making a comparison with this other pattern, but does that help that part?
It does. It does. It makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. And then he goes on and he says, so, you know, when we're afraid of the inevitable hardship, that you take unto yourself more hardship, right? You know, so what we resist persists, right? You know, what we're running from or fighting with is gonna stay with us. And so we're learning, you know, because the ego naturally does that. We're learning how to surrender, how to accept, how to be with, how to go into, through, and out the other side of these, you know, challenges, and not get too lost in the dramas of the pain bodies, and try to help the pain bodies find a new truth about life. Because the pain bodies basically believe, you know, very painful things about life, right? And then again, once we, you know, anything we fear, we have to kind of face and feel so that we can never fear it again, right? You know, the only way we can get beyond fear is to go through it. As long as one has not gone through it, it is a hardship. Oh, there's a question here. Let me try. How can a hardship not be a hardship? Take torture, for instance. I'm not afraid of death, but of the agony of dying. So the answer, as long as one has not gone through it, it is a hardship. You are not expected to tell yourself the opposite. Quite the contrary. To deny your fear would be one form of running away from or negating death and therefore life. Only those who have gone through death have the certainty that there is not death. To find this out, they must go through it. The lesser degrees of death, such as all forms of suffering, must also be experienced in order to discover that they are not the extremes of death or suffering that were feared. Often, they are not painful or annihilating at all. You will find many instances of this if you look back on your life. When you review certain of your life experiences, you will find that what you were apprehensive about and what seemed disproportionately horrible as you stood before it ceased to be dreadful once you were through it. Ultimately, you were untouched by it except in the positive sense because the experience caused you to grow. It added to your whole personality, not only to your thinking process, but also to your emotional life. So this is like 3D learning, right? It's not just intellectual learning. We're learning, embodied learning, experiential learning. If you can very truthfully question yourself in looking back, you can admit that the experience is no longer a horror, right? If you look back on your life to all the bad things you've gone through, like most people would think, well, I think I would go through it even again now, I'm on the other side of it, because of what it gave to me. Right. And also we do recognize, and I do this all the time, like usually what I'm imagining is not anything close to the reality. And so if I can just trust and surrender and kind of take step by step into the reality, a whole new experience happens, and that experience kind of cracks the cosmic egg of the image, right? It sets me free from this old psychic pattern embedded in my consciousness. So that's basically what we're doing here, is freeing our consciousness out of these structures and beliefs that we've picked up even in other lifetimes and we've brought back in here to, discover the bigger truth. Only an illusion loses intensity as time goes by. Right? Yet as long as you experience something that is unreal as a reality, the remedy is not in talking yourself out of it. Trying to avoid the inevitable is useless. Even if we know it's not real, it's like if we can't, if that's what we're feeling, we have to work directly with that part of us that believes it's real, right? And not just deny. So trying to avoid the inevitable is useless. What really helps is to acknowledge your fear and suffering, and this is the hard part, relax into it. It makes a huge difference. And we can do this when we offer ourselves compassion. This is why it's so important to, shift that relationship with ourselves, because if we cannot be hard-ass with ourselves and can begin to offer compassion when we are in fear and suffering, that helps us a lot to relax into it. When we're in judgment of ourselves, we're just, it's going to just make it worse. You cannot avoid the illusion of suffering by telling yourself it is illusion. For you it is real, and therefore you have to go through it. Remain conscious of your intellectual knowledge all the while without forcing it on your emotional reaction. Allow both to exist freely, side by side. And this may sound kind of strange, but it can be done, right? And that's a part of the inner work that we practice and learn how to do in individual sessions and in other, process kinds of formats. So, allow both to exist freely side by side as you observe your thoughts and feelings. This may make it easier for you to go through the suffering and really experience it. For only a wholehearted entering into the life experience with all its components will help you to rise above the dualities. You said one could let people down by untruthfulness and not by any other way. Could you explain that a little more, please? When I use the word truth, I do not mean the little truths people often express in a thoughtless and cruel way, which have nothing to do with truth. At times, like he's saying, if we're confronting somebody, like I see, something there, and he generally says, we don't want to, sort of mask, go along with things, that are, clearly something, like there's a law of brotherhood where he does say that we should, challenge each other or confront each other kinds of things, right? And at times he says, the great truth may not contradict the little truths at all. I lost myself, let me go back. When I use the word truth, I do not mean the little truths people often express in a thoughtless and cruel way, which have nothing to do with truth. At times, the great truth may not contradict the little truth at all. The little truth, however, may at other times be very much opposed to the great truth. There is no rule or regulation you can lean on here. As with all truth, each case stands for itself. And this is why we have to be in the moment with the experience, and not in any generalization and any, projection of our mental belief structure. Discrimination and an active thought process are necessary all the way through in order to realize when a little truth corresponds with the great truth or when it does not. One's own motivation furnishes the real answer to this question. If one is honest with oneself, one can detect that little hurtful truths come from a personal fault or weakness, be it pride, vanity, self-will, rebellion, insecurity, frustration, or whatever. Even if these inner motives are covered up by more valid reasons, that does not eliminate the existence of the underlying current which determines the result. So we often have mixed motives in things, is partly what he's saying here, and we have to examine what's our intention deep down inside with this thing, right? And that's a very subtle thing to, and we often rationalize, right? We have we have our reason, and that may be true, but there also may be something else there. So we have to look deeply inside what is our total intent. When you are truthful with yourself, you cannot, in the ultimate sense, let down anyone else. Gaining this truthfulness with the self is, after all, the goal of your self-search on this path. I would like to ask you about the emphasis the Church places on the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. What is your comment on this? There are two aspects involved, one of which I have commented on in the past. About the first aspect, I repeat briefly that it is a misconception that stems from the inherent fear of physical death. People want to believe in a physical continuation of life, therefore they need to interpret Jesus' reappearance as a physical resurrection. The other aspect has a much deeper and wider significance. It contains the deepest wisdom and truth, but in symbolic form. This symbolism I explained extensively in the previous lecture. Jesus Christ's resurrection teaches symbolically that if you do not flee from your fear of death, suffering, and unknown, but go through it, you will truly have life in its deepest sense while you are still in the body. Pure, unadulterated life can be had only if death is met squarely. The body is part of the spirit, and the spirit part of the body. Both form one whole. That is why Jesus Christ appeared as a human body, to show that the body is not to be rejected or denied. If you accept death, you will be resurrected in life, in the body, by the flowing life force, which will truly make you experience pleasure and joy on all levels of your being, including the physical level. Is that clear? Yes, but your statement as to the error of this thinking would lead one to conclude that the parts of the gospel which describe the disciples' arrival at the tomb as a story of promise are entirely false and not a factual account. Answer: no, not at all. When Jesus appeared to his disciples, his dear ones, a phenomenon occurred that has always been known and will continue to be known if certain circumstances prevail. In your time and age, it is called, I believe, a materialization of spirit substance. It is condensation of spirit matter, as all physical life is. But the fact that this happened contains a deep philosophical and psychological meaning which is generally ignored. So I don't know if people are familiar, but in many spiritist circles, that it's like there's the, this soul substance that the guy talks about, or, this kind of matter. And in the spiritual domain, we still retain a kind of spirit body, and with enough energy, like in seances or that kind of thing, often a materialization of the spirit, can happen. So I don't know about often, but it can happen. Now, those of you who do not consciously believe in existence after death and do not consciously desire existence past death very much like to enjoy and take pleasure in this present physical life, meaning the body and the pleasures and sensations of the body. I would like to ask a question concerning such a person. Given talent and a certain personality, including the need to sublimate, is the desire to produce art and by that creation become immortal the same thing as a belief in life after death? I know, I'm not asking if there is life after death. I know you're not, and I'm not going to attempt to answer that. For whatever I or anyone else might say would not make any difference. You can arrive at it only through your own experience. If you superimpose a belief that is not genuinely yours, it is much more unhealthy than admitting an unbelief. In the first place, now he's answering the other aspect, let me make it quite clear that the real knowledge and experience of the continuation of life after physical death, if it is generally arrived at through development and the right and healthy attitude as described in these lectures, does not, cannot, and will not sacrifice the bodily pleasure for the sake of a spiritual life to come after the physical one. It is quite the contrary. Only those who cling to religious faith out of fear and weakness will come to the conclusion that one opposes the other. In fact, if these two lectures are really understood, this will become quite apparent. Since the freed up life force must flow through the body, it makes the whole person more receptive and capable of pleasure on all levels, including the physical one. However, this complete pleasure can be experienced only if the soul is healthy. An unhealthy soul is incapable of experiencing pleasure. At the same time, if a person heals unhealthy aspects and attitudes of the personality, that person not only becomes capable of experiencing greater pleasure, but also leads a fuller life. Almost as a byproduct, there is also an increase of creativity. People like that begin to experience the reality of the spiritual laws and truth. The true experience of pleasure on all levels, the unfoldment of creative abilities, and the inner knowledge of spiritual truth all result from inner health. At the same time, the sicker or more distorted the soul, the less it is capable of real pleasure, and the more will its inherent creative abilities be paralyzed. The fact that some people are very creative in spite of tremendous inner conflicts does not contradict this statement. The desire for immortality through art is just another variation of the humanity's longing for life eternal and its struggle against death. One person will be a religious fanatic who has accepted a belief out of fear and weakness and not through inner knowledge. Another believes to be stronger than the former because he or she does not need such faith. But this form of expression, through the work produced, emerges from the same root, the desire for immortality. Neither wants to let go. They want to hold on to life. They cannot give up. This holding on, this inability to give up, whether manifest in the big questions or in little everyday issues, holds the soul imprisoned. It prevents growth, produces some form of stagnation on all levels of the personality. Only the generous freedom which comes from giving oneself up and going into the unknown without any reassurance of retaining what one cherishes can produce the true growth. So this is a very powerful thing, and even in the very beginning of the lectures, he has a lecture something on this as well, right? That ultimately there is no sacrifice, but if we're clinging to something, right, and are not surrendering, then that holds us imprisoned. And so only true freedom can come in this process of surrendering any self-will, to the larger ongoing journey of life. And it's like part of this deep work that we do, because we have this self-will that wants what it wants, desires and fears, right? And it's continually challenged, and again there is a kind of subtle area of, well, don't surrender where you don't have to, go for what you desire, right? But in the long run, we also have to be capable and willing to make this surrender in a trust that, even though it's not exactly what we want right now, that there's something, it is what it needs to be, and there will be a resurrection, a new understanding that will grow out of it. So the wish for immortality through art or science or any other expression is in essence not that different from the way of the religionist who clings to faith out of fear. As I explained in the last lecture, the atheist too goes off the path and meets death in the wrong way, just as the ungenuine religious person does. The latter says, I want to believe because I am afraid of death, and I do not want to let go to give up. The atheist says, the person who believes is just weak. I am so much stronger, I do not need all that. But this person too wants immortality and thinks it is a show of strength to seek immortality through creation. In another way of clinging to life, it is another way of clinging to life and fighting against death. This type of person is so afraid of ceasing to exist that he will not risk believing and then being disappointed if the religionists are wrong. Both types are incapable of admitting that they do not know, and they have to accept the unknown. So, and of course, we're all here in this time, with near-death experiences and, kind of all of this interesting stuff that we're learning about life and death now and everything. I think, there's a way that, we want to substitute sort of New Age beliefs and even the guide stories, right? So I want to just invite us all to, entertain those. All of these are wonderful, and I find that there are some that are more life-giving stories than others. So, it's like if we're going to choose a story, let's choose a life-giving story. But in that process, know that it's just a choice, and that ultimately we don't know. And the true surrender to that unknown is also, part of this journey. And in some ways, it's interesting because every day, like it's the ego that makes this fiction that there is anything known, right? We have, things going along in this kind of expected way, and in our sort of unconscious imagination, we just think it's all going to continue, but it doesn't. And that's when we, have crises or get shaken or, have to, and if we're kind of more in reality, it's like every new moment, it has all of these possibilities, and, if we can, be open. Again, we are storytellers. We have to live a life here, so we have to have some kind of story to live within and structure. But where we can, recognize that it is just a story, and that there are deeper levels that we are beyond us. It keeps us humble. It opens us to the mystery, and it begins to make us aware of the presence of God in the events of our lives. So I love that part, right? It's like the more that we can surrender, the more God shows up in different ways. So he's also talking here about sort of art as a sublimation or creativity as a sublimation, and I would say, that it can be used that way, but it also can be used for the pure joy of being, right? It is also who we are. And so, again, you have to discern, is what this is, am I sublimating or what? What's the inner intention, the inner motive? So sublimation can be, and very often is, entirely misunderstood and is a very unhealthy phenomenon. It can be a distorted, harmless process in the religionist as well as the psychoanalyst concept. The religionist sublimates when he says the life of the flesh is sinful, it opposes the spirit, it represents the devil, and therefore I must sublimate my fleshly impulses and spiritualize them. This leads to repression And when you view repression from a fresh outlook, you will see that it is nothing more than dishonesty, self-deception, an ostrich attitude, and a lack of self-awareness. On the other side, the psychologist asserts that reality is so dismal, so hopeless, so despairing, and stands in such contradiction to my pleasure drive that I have no choice other than to sublimate. I choose it out of compromise as a lesser evil. On the one hand, I would have to live according to the most unchanneled and primitive instincts if I wanted to realize my pleasure drive. But on the other hand, this would bring me into conflict with my environment, and therefore I would be stopped from pleasure a priori. So the situation is hopeless. These unchanneled primitive instincts are not more conducive to the pleasure principle than is the spiritualized rejection of bodily pleasure. In a mature and healthy soul, the pleasure drive can never interfere with one's environment. This is not due to sublimation, resignation, or repression. It happens because the instincts grow within the rest of the personality and therefore become, as development proceeds, all the more receptive to pleasure in a much higher form than the primitive, unchanneled instincts. This heightened pleasure includes the physical level. Such inclusion comes in turn from facing death and suffering. It happens through eliminating negation and slowly, bit by bit, melting away the duality. In doing so, reality as you know it on earth begins to change, first subtly in your own inner world and then slowly in the outer world. It is entirely wrong to say that creative ability is the product of sublimation, or to put it in a different way, that it comes from shifting the pleasure drive to another area of the personality. The healthy human personality, as it was meant to be, is rich enough to contain both, as well as many other modes of expression in life. So, we're here at the conclusion. My dearest friends, on this very special day, I have tried to show you how the present phase of our work of inner development fits in with the greatest events of the history of evolution, cosmic and human. Be blessed, all of you. Receive our strength, love, and blessings. May you take this strength and utilize it as is best for each of you. Be in peace. Be in God. So any final comments or questions on any of that last bit? Some of the Q&As get a little kind of specific in certain things.
I have a question. When you were speaking about we don't really know, you don't think it's possible that you could emotionally know that there's no such thing as death?
I take your meaning. I mean, I think there is a deep intuitive knowing that, we go on maybe, but we really don't know, and the guide is kind of in this place saying, you're going to be afraid to some degree because of it is an unknown. What's that like, where what happens to us. And so I think in that way, but I think it helps a lot to have, and I think he does say in this, as we develop and go through these little deaths, we come to develop a faith and this inner knowing that the very nature of life, and we see it in all the, on the earth and in the universe, like this nothing is lost, right? Everything is transformed and continues. So I think, that there is a way that we, ground deeply into some kind of trust in, we gladly sort of are free from some of the real fear of annihilation, of non-existence after death.
Yeah.
Great question. Thanks, Ray. Anybody else?
Real quick one, if you got time, Darlene.
Sure. Sure.
You mentioned earlier to Ursula something about healthy interdependency is basically, a reliance on my inner self. Words to that effect. So is there a particular lecture that says that, or are all the lectures designed to give you a healthy inner self?
I think many lectures, yeah, I think all the lectures are. And then I think, lectures on authority, right? Is a good one. There's others, that are kind of like more specifically with that. But they all point to that and often, bring up, sort of that difficulty, because in our psyches it's a kind of big split inside of us, right? And the confusion is, like the child usually who experienced isolation in some way and lack of support, kind of lives in this state of, nobody's out there to help me, right? And keeps looking out there for somebody to come and help them. And this is where, in order to go, beyond that, we have to help the child recognize that who's here to help them, first and foremost, is the one inside of us, right? Our own adult self, right? That's already here now. Maybe even our spiritual awareness. We can always also, pray or seek guidance, right? And get help that way. So, but we do have to sort of have this, self-reliance, or else it becomes this codependency kind of inner process. And then if we have the self-reliance, then we do have what he was talking about, this interdependency, right? We don't have to be alone. It's not meaning that, like because I can do, I want to be alone, but because I can be a full human being, instead of being a half human being, need another half, to complete me, I can be a whole human being, and then there's this great synergy with all of the other human beings that come, and both challenge and support me, right? And that's a part of the richness and pleasure of life. So, does that help?
Yeah, it does. For me, you're just describing all of the lectures. So
Yeah, it is. It exactly is. I agree. It's all of the. I mean, in some ways, every lecture is describing all the lectures, right? It's like there's just these different. To me, it almost feels like a diamond with facets, right? And it's like the same diamond, and then it's like looking into these different facets, and then after we've looked at several or many facets, we begin to, see this whole picture that begins to emerge, right? And it's all interconnected, and it's kind of like a whole new, life story or understanding of things, that helps us, and we begin to, place our life within that context, and that's also a part of the healing that it offers, I think. Okay. We done?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Darlene.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Glad that welcome for Faye and Ursula to be back with us again. I think next week I've pulled out this lecture on the great existential fear and longing. Is that 173, Frank?
I don't know.
No, yeah, I can't. That's probably not right. But anyway, if you just Google under, Pathwork lectures, the great existential fear and longing, and I'll send it out. But, if you wanted to read it in advance, that's...
Before you go, do you use the same link every week? Because the link, the link to the Zoom was not in the email.
Yeah, sorry, Frank. I didn't realize that. I screwed up. And yes, I do use the same link every week. So, if I ever do that again, you seem to have managed to find it. And I'm glad. Thank you.
All right.
I hope I didn't completely, lose anybody totally. But, that was a mistake on my part. So hopefully I won't forget next time.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah.
See ya.
Night all.
Night.
Thank you.
Night.
Bye. Thank you.